Hello. Hello. My name is Liliane Silva. I'm the forage specialist for Clemson, and today I'll be talking about forage quality in stockpiled bermudagrass systems. So, when we're talking about this topic, we need to understand the production period that we usually see for bermudagrass in our region. So here we have a visual distribution, just an estimate of that production period for bermudagrass in our region. And usually, we are going to be thinking about other alternatives to deal with the seasonality of production that we have from periods of time that we are not going to see our main perennial grasses growing during those times. So for us for Bermuda grass, when we're thinking about periods of time that we need to plan for having additional forages to feed our livestock, we're going to be thinking about fall and winter months, just because these are the periods of time that the Bermuda grass will slow down its growth and become dormant until it starts to regrow in early spring when the temperature starts to warm up again. So we have some options of strategies that we can use to deal with this seasonality of production. One being feeding hay or baleage or even other supplements, feedstuff that we might be able to use during this time. Another option is to plant some annual cool-season species so the animals can be grazing them during those months of the year. And a third option is stockpiling forage, and this is the focus of this presentation that we will be seeing information today about it. So when we're talking about stockpiling forages, we're going to think about harvesting that the forage mass that we have there to 4-inch stubble high around like August, and then allow the regrowth to accumulate. We usually think about letting the forage, the pasture grow for 6 weeks or so before we start grazing that field. And just after we remove the forage, either by grazing or cutting for hay, we are going to need to apply some fertilizer. It's a good practice to put some nitrogen and potassium, around 50 to 100 pounds of each nutrient is the recommendation, just because we're going to be really working on improving the quality and the production, the forage accumulation that we're going to see on those fields. So like I said, usually in general, we're going to be thinking about start grazing those fields around mid-October. Then in terms of the grazing management options that we have, rotational management is something that it's reliable, that can be used. But for this type of system, so we can really work on improving the grazing efficiency, a recommendation is to use strip grazing. For those of you that are not familiar with strip grazing, it is a method that we are going to use temporary fencing, that we're going to be moving it around. And we allow the animals to have access to a small area at time for short periods of time. And then we move them forward in the pasture. So this practice allows us to adjust the size of the strip that we would like them to have access to. And through that, we allow them to stay for a short period of time. It's going to be usually 2 to 3 days in each strip. Then we move them forward. And when we do this, we're going to be limiting the access that they have to each portion of the pasture. And through this way, they are going to really be able to remove more uniformly that forage. And through that, we are going to be increasing the grazing efficiency. And even we are able to even work some of the quality aspects as well, just because we will be able to really allow the animals to remove to the stubble high that we would like to in a more uniform way, so they're not overgrazing a portion of the field and undergrazing other portions of the field as much as we would see if they were giving access to the whole field at the beginning of the grazing period and remain there for the total periods that they are going to have access to that stockpiled forage. So, like I mentioned before, this is just a visual of how the strip grazing method would work. So, if this was going to be our whole field, we would be splitting the field in small strips at each time and allowing the animals to stay on each strip. So let's say they are here. So they are grazing just for 3 days. And then we adjust the size of the next strip and move them ahead. And we are going to continue to do this until the end of the period of time that we would be able to graze that field on the season, on the fall. And in terms of the expected grazing efficiency that we would be looking at, so this is just a general comparison. When we're using continuous grazing, we would have a lower grazing efficiency than compared to rotational grazing. And this is in general, even for the growing season, for periods for bermudagrass as well. And when we are using strip grazing, in this case, especially for the fall months, we're able to manage more intensively those fields. So we would be able to look at 70-75% grazing efficiency for this grazing management applied on fall. This does not translate to the management that we would be able to do during the growing season of bermudagrass, because if we were to manage this intensively, the fields, we would be compromising the ability of the plants to replenish their reserves in the roots throughout the growing season, and this would be impacting their ability to continue to grow over time and really coming back after each dormant period. We are able to manage this field a little more intensive because the plant will already be dormant at the time that we start grazing, or will be going into dormance at the time. So it's not going to be growing as much or at all at a given point of the fall months. And this is not going to affect the reserves of the plant as much as it would during the growing season. So when we're talking about forage quality, we need to understand first what we're going to be looking at in forages, or even on the test when we're conducting a forage analysis. And in general, we're literally just talking about the nutrient concentrations that we have on those forages. So we do need to understand the impact that forage quality will have on the animal performance, and also on the need for supplementation. So it's important to really understand what you have in terms of nutrients on your pastures before you calculate the supplementation requirements for animals, for animal categories. Just because we might be adding nutrients or amount of each nutrient that we might not necessarily need, and that reflects on the cost associated with growing those animals, and really the total costs of production as well. And even if we were not giving enough nutrients to the animals, it will also impact their ability to gain weight. And then this is going to also impact the prices and the time that you're going to be able to sell that animal on its final growth period as well. So forage quality will directly impact their intake, animal health, and performance. So the final animal product as well. Here I'm thinking more about beef cattle, but also if you're dealing with dairy or other livestock animals, you might be looking at milk or some other production aspects. So it's also going to be impact their response to based on the quality of the forage that they are consuming. And there are some general aspects that parameters that we usually look when we're talking about forage quality. The most common ones are usually treat protein and TDN, but we also have through a forage analysis, we're also going to have information on the fiber concentrations that we have there, and the mineral levels as well. So this helps us to understand what quality range our forage is classified in terms of TDN, and then it also helps us to calculate those supplementation needs, as I mentioned before, because then we are going to be really just looking at adding as much of each nutrient that we need to the animal diet to supplement them, so they are able to respond with their best way for to achieve the animal performance, the weight gain or the dairy production that we would like per day or per season. These are just some general numbers. So in terms of forage quality in general, stockpile-bermudagrass crude protein will be ranging from 8 to 12%. It can be a little close to 14. It really depends on the fertilization management that you are going to be using throughout the season, and also how much fertilizer you are going to be applying just after you cut or graze to start that stockpiling period. So this is going to be some input of nutrients there as well that is going to be impacting how much nitrogen the plants will have available, and how much crude protein we're going to see on that plant. So on this table here on the top, we have some information that was collected in Alabama in recent years. And the two lines on the top, they are just bermudagrass by itself that was stockpiled. And then the last line is a mixture of alfalfa-bermudagrass. And we can see that on the bermudagrass system, we had a 50 pounds of nitrogen input, as opposed to the alfalfa-bermudagrass, there was no nitrogen applied at the beginning of the stockpiling period. The reason for this is that alfalfa is a legume, so it's going to be fixing nitrogen and inputting that nitrogen into the system. And it's going to be the sole source of nitrogen for the bermudagrass at that mixture. So we do have some estimate of forage mass here, and you can see that the amount that was measured on the bermudagrass by itself was higher for forage mass. than the alfalfa-bermudagrass mixture. And we can see some differences. Usually it's not as high as this case. It's usually a little more close to 3,500 or so that we would be seeing the alfalfa-bermudagrass mixture accumulating during these periods. But in this case, we also had a difference because the two systems on the top were grazed throughout the whole season, as opposed to the alfalfa-bermudagrass system was just clipped, so just harvest for hay during the previous months. We are going to see a very important difference on the level of crude protein that we're going to have on these systems. So as I mentioned before, alfalfa is a legume, so we're going to see an improved input of nitrogen in that mixture just because of the legume that we have there. So it's going to be increasing the forage quality that we can have with that mixture, even though you might still have lower forage mass, this forage will have higher forage quality. So it's really important to understand this concept of the forage quantity versus the quality and how this is going to be impacting the animal responses to that as well. So you can consider if it makes sense for you to add a legume to your Bermudagrass system or not, and understanding what the difference will be in terms of forage mass and that quality that's going to be observed. And in the stockpiled system, we are going to see a decline of quality over time. So when I say over time here, I'm thinking about from the beginning of the grazing period, which would be usually mid to late October, through through the time that you actually end the grazing period. Some producers usually they are going to be grazing through January. Some producers they might just need to graze through early December. So this really depends how you're managing your general system, how long you're going to be really extending these grazing periods on the Bermudagrass that was stockpiled and how much forage you actually have there as well. But the senescence that we are going to observe the plants going into senescence, which is just the plants start to die, the material that we can see start to die, the above ground material, and how that associated with environmental conditions, so rainfall, will be reducing the forage quality over time, over that period when you first start grazing through the time that you're ending that grazing. This is expected, and we need to understand that there will be that decline, so we need to be sure to account for, to adjust supplementation if we need it, just so we can really be working on the quality of the material that the animals are eating. And like I said, the fertilization that we do at the beginning of the stockpiling period, after we just cut it or graze it, that field, it's going to be reflecting the amount of nutrients that are going to be in the plant, and also the forage mass accumulated during that period. So it's important to think about how much of nitrogen and potassium you can put, and this is going to be important to determine how much forage you're going to have available there. Then something that we need to think about is to measure the forage mass that you have available on those areas that you are going to be adjusting the strip for the animals to graze, and calculate based on how many days you would like them to have access to those strips as well. So you're not letting them stay there for too long and they're struggling to get enough feed, enough forage intake during that time as well. Then something else that we do need to remember is that the impacts that we're going to be implementing throughout the whole season, the whole growing season, it's going to be affecting the stand healthy, especially in terms of the energy reserves that those plants can accumulate over time to be able to undergo the winter months, the months that they are going to be dormant. So this is really important to understand how the intensity and the frequency of the harvest that you're making, either by grazing or cutting your fields, how much that's going to be impacting those plants individually and also on the whole stand and the stand health and longevity over time. So on the left side here, I have a couple of pictures. The one on the top, it was grazed too low, too often, as opposed the one on the bottom, it was grazed based on the recommendations, the proper recommendations for this mixture. So you can see the difference. This was on a single year. We saw how the plant starts to really die and that stand starts to thin out. And then in one growing season, you can really compromise that stand persistence over time. This was a Alfalfa-bermudagrass mixture, and the recommended stubble height is 4 inches, and the recommended resting time is 28 days to 35 days before we turn the animals back in those pastures. And on the right, we can see some responses for root biomass in Bahia grass plants when they were grazed really heavily, moderate, or light. And this was the response that we observed. So you can see how much more roots and how deep those roots go under the proper recommendation, which was the moderate intensity, moderate grazing methods. And the light as well. The light was just cut or grazed a couple of times per year. This is not what we would be generally recommending, just because you would like to have that to be able to use that forage when you have the proper balance between quality and quantity. So for Bahia grass, we would also be grazing or cutting those forages, those pastures to 4 inches stubble high, and giving a resting period around 28 to 32 days as well during the growing season. So we do need to think about what's happening under the below ground, as well as what's happening above ground when we're managing our pastures, and understand that the management that we're going to be using throughout the growing season, it's going to be impacting that stand through the remainder of the year as well, even when those plants are going into dormancy, and their ability to really have enough energy reserves accumulated in the root system to be able to grow back the next year and persist over time. When we are thinking about the way that we're going to be managing those pastures year round, we're also going to be trying to optimize the nutrient recycling that's happening on that system. So the way that we are going to be able to improve the recycling is to really be able to work on the distribution as well of those nutrients. So it is recommended to use rotational management throughout the growing season, just because it's going to be allowing those animals to remove the forage more uniformly, and also distribute the excreta, the manure, and the around to really be working on better distribution of manure and urine around that area throughout the year. And then we are going to be also doing that when we use strip grazing or the rotational management on fall months by moving those animals through that area, allowing them to stay for a short period of time, then moving them forward, and allowing them to redistribute what they are consuming on those trips. It's also important to always think about adjusting the stocking rate that you're using. So this is really important, especially during the growing season, because the plant's not going to be growing at the same rate, at the same speed throughout the whole growing period. So when we think about bermudagrass growing period, we're thinking about late March, early April through late September or early October in most places throughout our state. So we are going to have some peak of production for bermudagrass in June through August, and that's going to be the bermudagrass is going to be accumulating forage on a faster rate than in the other months during this growing season. So when we think about that, we could not expect to have the same number of animals grazing the IA field throughout the whole time, just because if we had that, we would be undergrazing in some periods of time, and as opposed to be overgrazing in other periods of time if we're not adjusting that stocking weight for that bermudagrass field. Then an option that is viable for our general region is to include legumes in the bermudagrass system, either through what I'm showing here, that's alfalfa into bermudagrass, or just by planting clovers during the cooler months of the year. They are going to be growing there and accumulating some nitrogen and inputting that nitrogen into the system, so those the bermudagrass can use when it starts to regrow back on spring. For this case, for alfalfa into bermudagrass, it's a option to decrease the reliance on nitrogen fertilizer and to reduce the need for supplementation, just because we're going to be able to work in having a higher, a better forage production and quality, and that feed's going to be offered for the animals, so it's going to be better quality for them. When we think about this alfalfa-bermudagrass mixtures, we consider bermudagrass because it has similar soil fertility and drainage requirements to alfalfa, and they have a complemental growth period. So you are able to have both species growing at the same time in the field, as you see on the picture, and then alfalfa is going to slow down its growth when the temperature goes over 78, then pick back up in kind of like mid-September, early October. It's going to be picking back up and really being a larger portion of that mixture. So that's why we see an increase on the crude protein, the quality that we see on those pastures for the animals to be grazing. And this system can be stockpiled, so this helps with cutting costs of feeding hay and also the supplementation that you're going to be using, and allows us to extend that grazing season, just because we're still going to have the alfalfa growing for a little longer periods than the bermudagrass would be growing on that early to mid fall. Then, just in general, if you are considering establishing alfalfa into bermudagrass, This has to be done after you already have the Bermudagrass stand well established. So you would come and interseed the alfalfa into Bermudagrass fields in fall using a 14-inch row space. And this is a system, like I said before, that is going to be growing most months of the year, just because of the complemental growth of the species. And it allows to cut back on nitrogen inputs, just because the legume will be fixing that nitrogen and supplying for the Bermuda grass. It can be used under grazing. So the recommendation is to use rotational grazing for this mixture, just because we need to make sure that we're giving enough rest time for the plants to grow back, especially for the alfalfa plants, and can also be used under hay or baleage production. So the recommended sample height is the same for either management. It's going to be 4 inches, as well as the resting period is going to be 28, 35 days, the recommended regrowth period before you bring those animals back to graze, or you cut those fields again during the growing season. So here I'm showing some information about forage mass accumulation for different stockpiling periods. So for this study, we allow the Alfalfa-bermudagrass mixture to regrow for 6, 8, 10, 12, or 14 weeks. And then we also looked at the crude protein and digestibility that we had on those treatments. And we saw a range for crude protein between 15 to 26%. So we are talking about fall months here. And having anything over 20% of crude protein during the fall months is really high. And a lot of the animals don't even need to have that over 22% of crude protein during their lifetime to respond with the animal performance that we usually expect from them. So this is just to emphasize that you can still have a really good quality material during those period of times, even at the 14-week stockpiling period, that you can still have 15 to 16% of crude protein on this mixture, and with high digestibility as well. Then we do see a difference in proportion of the species in the mixture over time. This will really be varying depending on the level of management that you are doing for those fields. So this was what happened for one of the areas that we managed for a couple of years under clipping, only cutting. But it really depends how that management is being done. And this is going to impact how the response, how much of alfalfa we're going to continue to have over time on the Alfalfa-bermudagrass mixture on the field. If you're interested in planting and establishing Alfalfa-bermudagrass systems, we do have a couple of resources that you can Google, and you can find this, or you can reach out to me. I'll be glad to share them with you. And they were done earlier this year, and we were able to work on them through a NAFA, National Alfalfa Forage Alliance grant that we have, and Drs. Mullenix and Dr. Tucker, they are also co-authors here on this guide, and they have been working with Alfalfa-bermudagrass mixtures for several years now, and they are also really good resources for questions and to look for more material that they have developed and research as well that they have conducted over the past years. just to mention some points here. So we have we can have some risks associated with stockpiled vermiculite systems. Um, there are things that we cannot control. One of them, if you're working agriculture for any number of years, you're really familiar with how much we cannot control the weather. So if we end up having a year that we either get limited rainfall in late summer and early fall, just can reduce the forage accumulation that we have, or if we get the opposite of that, if we get excessive rainfall in the same period, or even when we already have the stockpiled bermudagrass there, just sitting there waiting to be grazed. If we end up having excessive rainfall that it's gonna have waterlogging there, we could have some issues with fungal diseases and fungus to spreading fast. So these are things that can happen. As well as early frost that could compromise and the forage growth and the accumulation that we could have for the field on a given year. So these are things that I thought I should mention because I think it's important to always have a plan B. And this plan B could be just planting cool season forages that you can still have the animals grazing those areas. If you're not doing this, I would highly recommend you to consider doing this because it's a way to cut costs of having to feed hay for such a long period of time. And the cool season forages have high forage quality, so it's going to be really working on improving that weight gain response that you're going to get through the cooler months of the year. Stockpiling is a cost-effective practice that will help you to close this gap that we have for forage in early fall and early to mid-fall. So it's something that we can really rely on to be able to optimize the feasibility of our system, the profitability that we're seeing, and until the cool season forages are ready to be grazed. So like I said, when we're using stockpiled systems, stockpiled bermudagrass, it's gonna help us with cutting some costs of having to feed hay. And this is a valuable practice that producers can use when you are using bermudagrass systems. So it's worth to think about and consider stockpiling, even if just a small area of your pastures, so you can have that forage available for the animals to graze until maybe mid-December, late December, when your cool season forages are ready to go. This is what I had to talk today about this topic. If you have any questions, my email is here on the screen, on the bottom of the screen. Please let me know, get in contact with me, and I appreciate you watching this. Thank you.